Today's show is the audio from a recent webinar about how stats inform and distort the NBA awards debate. This webinar was hosted by Howard Beck, who previously worked with Sports Illustrated, Bleacher Report, and the New York Times, where he was a reporter and writer, as well as Seth Partnow, who is StatsBomb's Director of North American Sports and a contributor for The Athletic. They discussed the validity of analytics in basketball, which stats matter and carry weight in the award decision, and how accurate the eye test is when analyzing a game. They also took questions from attendees, which ended up being a very educational Q&A session. If you ever wonder how stats can inform and distort the NBA award debate, then I have no doubt you will find this episode extremely helpful and informative.
The joker's on you, my friend. How stats inform and distort the NBA awards debate. My name is Larry Coon. I'm the general manager of Sports Business Classroom, here to welcome you to this webinar. I have with me a couple of luminaries. Both of them are instructors at Sports Business Classroom. We have Howard Beck, who's been with the New York Times, Bleacher Report, SI, now with Locked On Sports. If you don't know him, you don't follow basketball. We also have Seth Partnow, our analytics expert, who is with StatsBomb, with The Athletic. He's also been the director of analytics for the Milwaukee Bucks. We will take questions. Go ahead and type them in to the chat and we will answer them toward the end. But for now, Howard, the joker's on me. What's going on? What up, Beck? Explain yourself.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Howard Beck. I'm a reporter and writer and occasional podcaster, I guess. I've been covering the NBA for 26 years, and I am not an analytics expert. I'm analytics curious, I guess. But as somebody who covers the league, I felt it's been my responsibility to learn as much as possible in recent years as we moved into this era. And I'd like to think that I've embraced the advanced stats and all that we can learn from them. And I'm pro analytics to the extent that it helps us understand the game better. But there are times, to me, as a reporter, where it feels like maybe we have become a little bit too enamored of the stats, maybe placing a little bit too much faith, even blind faith in the stats. And you definitely hear about that more at a time of year like this, where we have sent in our ballots. We are debating the awards. In fact, the awards are starting to be rolled out by the NBA this week. And so this is where Seth comes in. Seth is an expert in the field, basketball and data mixed with basketball. And he's way smarter than me on these things. So when I need questions answered about what we should and should not be doing with the stats that are available to us now, Seth is somebody I go to because he knows this stuff. He's literally written a book on it. So let's start there. I wanted to base this on, Seth, on the award season specifically, because when we talk about what we should and should not do, the do's and don'ts of using advanced stats, this is kind of where it reaches its fevered pitch, because especially now, I think let's just start with the MVP award. And by the way, I want to make this clear because I did come up with the title, The Joker's on You. My alternate title was Don't Trust the Process. So I had a joke about either Embiid or Jokic. Either way, it was going to work. It's not a slight on either of them.
Just on Giannis.
Just on Giannis, who I did not have a ready-made joke for. So Seth, let's start with MVP because it's the biggest award, of course. It's also the source of the biggest debate. And in fact, we have now reached the point where Jokic versus Embiid has become, I feel like, our latest proxy war in analytics versus eye test. There's a lot of it seeping into that. I don't buy the dichotomy of analytics versus eye test, and I know you don't either, but it's there. So let me start with this statement, which I heard a lot from people who were advocating for Jokic, not just this year, but in past years. Jokic leads in every advanced metric, win shares, box plus minus, estimated plus minus, real plus minus, many other things that say plus minus in them somewhere, vorps and schnorps, as our friend Zach Lowe would say. If he leads in all of these all-in-one stats, Seth, he must be the best, most valuable player in the NBA. Is that a valid way of summing up the utility of those stats and the validity of those stats?
I'm wary of using language like must. That leaving some room for doubt is certainly important in kind of the field of statistics in general. I will say that the reason why you look at a number of different of these all-in-ones is the ones that are well made, are well considered, are tested, are vetted. Some of them will do better at certain things than others. All of them will have holes. All of them will have strengths. There's certain kinds of players that will be overvalued, certain kind of players that will be undervalued, just depending on the methodology you use. And that's just a fact of statistical modeling. I mean, you're simplifying the world so that you can talk about it kind of in shorthand. And in that simplification, some things are going to get lost, some differences are going to get compressed. Now, the fact that almost no matter the methodology, that Jokic is showing up as having the most impact, which isn't the same thing as saying the best player, but it's having the most impact. That means whether you, as some stats, box plus minus, for example, is sometimes criticized with respect to Jokic because he gets a positional bonus versus assists, because normally speaking, centers who get assists, that's a great thing. How well that assumption applies to Jokic when he's more or less playing point guard on offense a lot of the time, that's a fair question. But if he's doing very well on that and doing very well on a stat like RAPM, call it non-prior informed RAPM, which means it's just kind of looking at how a team does, or how the player's team does with him on the floor, controlling for teammates and opponents, with no box score or anything like that built in. So that there's no part of assist, no part of block, no part of any other stats. If he's showing up as having the highest impact on both those and other methodologies that are sort of ticking different boxes, that's a pretty strong bit of evidence that, like, no matter which way you sort of crumble the cookie, that he almost regardless of your kind of statistical theory of basketball, he comes out on top. I think that is pretty strong evidence. Now, there are certainly there are aspects that is sort of not being captured. One of which is commonly applied is that sometimes a player can look better in these stats because his backups suck. And that's he's had a pretty big on-off differential because Denver's had pretty poor backup center play. It's not like Philadelphia has had wonderful backup center play either. So again, and I know I sort of got off base from the question a little bit, but I think it's that the fact that it's looking at it statistically from a number of different angles and still getting a similar picture showing up.
Yeah. So that makes sense to me, Seth. And I could see where if people have come up with all these different all-in-one stats and they're all weighted a little differently, have different factors baked in, all of which, by the way, is a complete mystery box to most of us, right? Those of us in media who are not numbers people, fans who are not necessarily statistically educated, we're going to go to these stats. We're going to look at the fancy name or acronym, Raptor, and all of these other newfangled stats and clever or not so clever acronyms. And we're just going to say, well, that I don't know how this stat was created, but it's telling me this thing. And I wonder how much faith we, the lay people, should put in it when we don't actually understand the methodology behind it. And somebody like you, if I asked you, we could spend 3 hours here and you could tell me where the flaws in each of these all-in-one metrics might be. And you'd tell me, well, this one is really good at identifying X, but not Y. And this one we all know to kind of put aside because it's way overvaluing, field goal percentage or something. I don't know. But I'm not going to know that when I'm scrolling through Basketball Reference, when I'm scrolling through any other publicly available stats site. So what do I or our audience do with this this maze of numbers, this alphabet soup that is then spitting out a number soup to boot, because it feels impenetrable?
That's completely fair. I mean, as you mentioned, Zach's talking about warps and schnorps, and I'm not a big fan of sort of the backronym naming convention where you you figure out what player you want to name it after, and sort of build the first letter of each word off of that.
There's the LeBron one too, right? Isn't there one that's called LeBron?
Yes. That's kind of, if you give me a choice between someone choosing to name the metric Darko and LeBron, I think Darko is more fun because it's kind of, you pick the more obscure player, and at least that's a little bit of whimsy. Whereas, I don't know, LeBron just seems almost, with the apologies to Christian Narsu who came up with LeBron, it's a little bit of a clickbaity title almost. All of which is me filibustering about not answering the question about how do you choose which one to use, and that's a great question. I mean, one of the things you can do is a lot of these metrics are, the people who've created them are in public, and just kind of ask them. Like, I think the leader in the clubhouse for the best publicly available, it's partially paywalled, but the best publicly available one is probably estimated plus minus. It's created by Taylor Snar, who was an analyst with the Jazz for a number of years. It's generally regarded as the best for a few different reasons. Most importantly, because it not only describes what's already happened well, but it predicts what will continue to happen better than most other stats. So you're getting a pretty good sense that if this metric thinks someone is good based on the next year of play and their team winning games when this player is on the floor, it's probably capturing something real as opposed to kind of atmospheric noise that where, I think if we don't have time to really dig into the clutch award, but if you look at metrics measuring like clutch win probability added and stuff like that, there isn't a lot of year to year consistency in who shows up well, because it's sort of an ephemeral thing that's kind of determined largely by small sample randomness. So I find the person, if you can, find the person who came up with it and ask about it and try to understand a little bit about what it is and is not measuring, and use it as a starting point. I'm actually not particularly a fan of sort by advanced stat, because, earlier I mentioned that these things, even if they're working correctly, are measuring how much impact a player has had rather than how good the player is. And those are slightly different questions, because that's, very much dependent on how the player is being used. You see, I don't know, one example is top of mind because they played last night. The version of Kevin Huerter we're getting in Sacramento and the one we got in Atlanta is a different player, just because he does more and different stuff in Sacramento. He probably improved to some degree as a player, but mostly he just has different opportunities now. So he's going to look like a different player on these metrics. So I kind of prefer to go bottom up. But if you're looking at the whole league and kind of want a rough estimation of who has done really well, starting with a metric like EPM will give you a decent sort of taxonomy of all right, these are the players who this year had an elite level of impact. And you can feel decently about that as a starting.
So I'll point out for our listeners that and viewers that EPM is estimated plus minus, and that is found at a site called dunksandthrees.com. Threes, the word spelled out. So people can find that there, Seth. But of course, as you noted, it is partially paywalled. So it is not entirely, I guess it's in the public realm. Yeah. But if you really want the full utility, you've got to pay for it. I can give one more that is free. Sure. If you go to NBAshotcharts.com, there's a version of regularized adjusted plus minus, which is, again, I mentioned earlier, sort of does not have a statistical prior. That sort of what the statistical prior does is essentially, the player who puts up the kind of the best stats in a different metric sort of gets the first dibs of the credit when his team does well with him on the floor. And that's shown to help these models a little bit. But I kind of like RAPM because it doesn't have that. And so therefore the black box element is completely removed. It's basically just what happened when this guy was on the floor controlling as well as we can for teammates and opponents.
And that is completely free. The problem is it's on a single year sample. Our APM is pretty noisy, but the good news is, which maybe doesn't help super much for a single season award like MVP, there are also 3 and 5 year versions of it available on the same site. So those are 2 resources that I tend to go to first for a lot of these things.
Okay, so I'm looking at dunks and threes right now, Seth, and I'm just going to put you on the spot for a second.
Mm-hmm.
All right, sorry, we were getting some buffering there for a second on the video. So if I go to dunks and threes right now, the leader in PM for the season, as expected and as discussed, is Nikola Jokic. He has a plus 7.9 estimated plus minus, and he's followed not too far behind at a plus 7.3 by Joel Embiid, and then Dame Lillard at 7.1. So the first question I want to ask here, aside from the fact that Giannis is way down, not way, but he's a few below, and he's after Dame Lillard, Jimmy Butler, Kawhi Leonard, Luka Doncic, Steph Curry, guys who were not in the MVP discussion at the end of the season. What is this telling us and not telling us? If EPM is, in your estimation, in the estimation of a lot of people in the analytics field, the best version of a public all-in-one stat, it's still obviously not going to capture everything. It has, I'm sure, I imagine some known snags, for lack of a better term. What is it telling me and not telling me when I see that Jokic has a 0.6 lead on Joel Embiid and that Dame Lillard is right on Embiid's heels and we weren't talking about him for MVP at all?
So this gets into sort of an important part about these things, which is the mere act of putting a number on something, especially if you drop a decimal place, it makes it look like there's a certain amount of precision. And really, from a statistical standpoint, this is an estimate. That's sort of the center point of our estimate. And so we think that Jokic is about 7.9 plus 7.9 points per 100. And we think that Embiid is about 7.3. Now, I mean, everyone's heard, if you've watched like polling data and stuff like that, everyone's heard, the statistical margin of error. That 0.6 difference it's hard to calculate formally the margin of error. But informally, like that 0.6 per 100 difference is not actually that much. I would guesstimate without necessarily being able to prove it. What's that suggesting is that this model thinks that there's a high 50s or low 60s% chance that Jokic was more impactful this year than Embiid on a per possession basis. Now that sounds like a lot, but if you're flipping a coin, it's 50-50. So it's a little bit confident, but not super confident that Jokic is better. Incidentally, since we're on EPM, and I looked this up the other day, and this is why partially the use of the Embiid versus Jokic is like stats versus not, is they've been 1-2 in this metric each of the last 3 years. So it's not like Embiid, famously hated on by the analytics community. It's just in general, looking at the totality of the evidence, I'm not gonna say everyone, but have tended to come out that of these 2 players who have been spectacular, you have to pick one, and one of them has been slightly better. And based on our best estimates, based on our methodologies and a variety of our methodologies, that's been Jokic. That's not like, it's not intended as a slight in any way on Embiid. It's there can be only one.
Sure. But as you've just noted, there's an implied precision or the appearance of precision where there isn't necessarily precision at that level. So there's a green number below the per 100 possessions number, and Jokic's is 100 and Embiid's is 99. I assume that is the percentile within the league, right? So if a guy is at the 99th versus the 100th percentile, even as an estimate, they're so damn close. So Seth's throwing up his hands. I would argue that implies that at that point, it is essentially a dead heat. And now it's up to kind of almost other personal judgment, right? So let me pull back for a second here to my perspective as a reporter covering the league for 26 years and as a voter for postseason awards most of that time. it's our own best judgment at the end of the day, right? We are all filtering this through our own perceptions of the league and what's valuable and what's not. And how much do you weigh the win totals of the specific teams? How much do you weigh their supporting cast? All these things that are a lot squishier and people chalk up to, quote unquote, the narrative, a term that drives me crazy because it's become a pejorative, and narrative is just a story. So I take in all that stuff and I think, well, if it's essentially a statistical dead heat, even by the best publicly available stats, then I need to start thinking about other factors too. This is where the Embiid camp would probably say, well, one thing that the stats never seem to capture very well, or don't capture as well as we hoped they could, or maybe one day will, is defense. And while people can, we could get into the weeds about advanced metrics and Jokic's defense versus Joel's, I think everybody agrees on some level, no matter what you think of Jokic's defense, or maybe he's underrated, overestimated, whatever. Embiid's the better defender. I think everybody agrees there. I think eye test, advanced stats, whoever, there are no camps on this one. Embiid's the better defender. So then the question becomes weighing Embiid's more balanced offensive, defensive repertoire versus Jokic's just historically great efficiency and his playmaking and his assist numbers. Can you make sense of all that as we try to process what we have available in data versus what we just have available in observation, or just as argument? Hey, I think this guy's actually, maybe he's not statistically as good as the other guy, but the stats don't count defense, and I know Embiid's better defensively, so I think I'm going to lean that direction. Like, how do you take into all that through the data prism?
So I would say that if we're talking about who, if we're playing Game 7 of a playoff series, who is going to play better defense? That's, I think, quite clearly going to be Embiid, and it's going to be a decent margin. But if we're talking about the MVP award this year, it's who has been more impactful on defense over the course of the season. And as with many players, when they become sort of high usage stars, and Embiid had very high usage here, you have to have high usage to lead the NBA in scoring. The possession by possession defensive, whether it's effort, and I don't mean that as a pejorative, right? It's hard to get up, to 25 shots per 100 possession in an NBA game, and that takes a lot of effort. And you don't have. My college coach used to describe, you have 10 arbitrary energy units. How many are you using in one area or another? I know it's weird, but it's like Embiid's probably using 8 of those on offense, and rightfully so. So there's not as much left for defense. So on a possession by possession, game by game basis, I would say that, and kind of the defensive metrics back this up a little bit, is that on a possession by possession basis, he is not necessarily expressing that defensive superiority over the course of the season. And if we're talking about who was most impactful over the course of the regular season, the fact that, and Embiid is hardly the first player for whom this is the case. Shaq, you covered Shaq at the time. The difference between a regular season defensive Shaq and playoff defensive Shaq, I think you can, we're just going to switch the eye test, but I think you can probably speak to that a little bit, right?
Oh, sure. Yes.
And so while he is capable of being the better defender, I guess it's a long-winded way of saying that hasn't always been the case this year, in part because he's put so much focus on his offensive game. And again, that's probably appropriate, because I think that's probably that's probably more helpful towards winning regular season games anyway.
Sure. And there's another piece of this where, if you are measuring one guy as being better offensively, one guy being slightly better defensively, and whatever, we tend to think, oh, maybe it cancels it out, but maybe one guy's much better offensively and the other guy. So that we start to deal with like these just gradations of trying to how do you weigh these things? And I think that's difficult. And I feel like even the all-in-one stats are not helping us necessarily in that regard. Are they?
No, I think that there's an assumption there in sort of a lot of these all-in-one stats. It's like there's a rating, and they have an offensive rating and a defensive rating, and you add them together. And what that implicitly assumes is that offensive and defensive contributions are equally valuable. And while there's a certain symmetry to that, I'm almost a little skeptical of that. I think there's been without getting too much in the weeds in it, there's a lot of indications that offense might be almost on an individual level might almost be twice as important as defense. So now that's not something I can necessarily prove, but that's sort of a thing in the back of my head. So on some level, I don't reject it, but the notion that a 1 point per 100 difference on defense counteracts a 1 point per 100 difference in the other direction on offense, I don't totally buy that. And by the way, it is basically never. I might even argue, even in Defensive Player of the Year voting, it has never been treated that way by voters in the past. So, and I'm not even sure they were wrong to value offense more highly.
Well, yeah, and traditionally the MVP has been a player who is among the best offensive players in the league, even at the expense of defense, right? I mean, this is a league where, Steph Curry has won back-to-back MVP and once unanimously and not known as a great defender, sometimes a pretty good defender, but it's not a big part of his repertoire. James Harden, Russell Westbrook, Steve Nash, Dirk Nowitzki. We have plenty of examples of outstanding offensive players. This is ultimately a league that's about scoring and shot creation and a lot of other things that are wrapped up in that, right? So we've never really, it doesn't mean that it's an excuse or it doesn't justify, the history doesn't necessarily justify us having downplayed defense all this time, but that tends to be the way that this league, not just media and fans view the value of players, but teams clearly too. Look at the way guys get paid. So it feels like that's all there. So let me drill down on one other aspect of this, because we would agree that Jokic and Embiid are both outstanding offensive players, albeit very, very different offensive players. Jokic is basically a point center, or you just say he's a point guard, whatever. What does guard even mean anymore in our positionally fluid world? Joel Embiid is not quite the passer, although his playmaking, I think, has improved over time. But he takes on a much bigger load in terms of his scoring. His usage rate, I don't have it up right now, but it's probably like 10 points or more beyond Joel Embiid's, or beyond Jokic's. How do we account for that gap as well? What is more valuable? Joel Embiid being willing to embrace and take on, even at the expense of lower efficiency, right? Jokic's advantage in part is the efficiency. Embiid, not quite as efficient in scoring, although very efficient compared to the average. But he's going to score and attempt to score a lot more often, which is a huge benefit for his teammates, right? Those are all shots that Tyrese Maxey and James Harden and Tobias Harris don't have to take. Joel Embiid's taking them on, and he's going to score at a higher percentage than they are anyway. Jokic prefers to be more playmaker than scorer. Can we place a relative value on those two things? Is it more valuable to have Jokic being the part-time scorer, part-time playmaker, or full-time playmaker, whatever it is, versus Joel Embiid, the traditional old school workhorse scorer?
So this is where we get into one of the really important things, and I think you kind of alluded to it earlier about sort of looking at the advanced numbers and just stopping. And that's part of the reason why it's important to use them as a starting point and not even if not a starting point, not just the complete analysis. Is a question like that, the answer is it depends. Funnily enough, I would almost say that the better the team you're on, the less that excess usage is helpful if it's coming at the cost of efficiency. You mentioned three other very good offensive players that Embiid is playing. Besides, like, if you gave some of the marginal shots that Embiid has taken to Maxey, to Harris, to Harden, I don't think it would be especially difficult to construct a scenario where those match or exceed the efficiency that Embiid has played with. It's not a knock on him. I think, with Harden's certainly the health problems Harden has had this year, maybe that's not as true as it might have been in the past. But that gets to part of the reason why, had I a vote, I would have voted for Jokic, is the fact that Jokic is, easy argument, like the argument for best passing center is over. He's in the discussion for best passer ever, period. Yeah. So there's that. And then there's also, he has been kind of depending on how you want to measure it, he has been the best combination of efficiency and volume as a scorer in the league this year. Now, some of that is because he's distributed the ball to Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. and Aaron Gordon and whoever else. But I think that's, I don't know, you can weigh whether that it counteracts the additional possessions that Embiid is soaking up or not. I think it's a pretty strong case. And then you add the passing on top of it. And it's just, I feel like the gap offensively is quite large. But you don't have to agree with that. That's just the argument. That's not compelled from the stats. That's me using the stats as part of the argument. And I think if there's a meta point here, it's that the something I've always told people who work for me or in classes I'm taking is a phrase that I hate is, well, the numbers say. The numbers don't say, you as the person say. You are using that as a piece of your argument, and you have to put it together in a way to construct another word you use, a narrative that tells the story of why you think this is important and why you think it indicates that this player A has been more impactful than player B. So, and part of that is I think that, part of your question is how to use these stats for someone who is not necessarily living in this area. You can take a piece of that and use it as an argumentation point alongside Embiid is a far better defender and he's more impactful in these other ways because of things I'm observing. Those things aren't, those aren't mutually exclusive. That's how you construct the argument, I would say.
Yeah.
And that's how you use it. If you're not going, I try not to make arguments on my own strictly only on the numbers to begin with. I try to include basketball as well. And it's important to do so.
Okay. So on that note, and bringing this back to the MVP discussion and the V part of it, valuable. So some of these all-in-one stats can estimate value based on all these other stats that are baked into it, right? And an algorithm that tries to account and properly weight for all these things. Do any of them actually take into account the number of wins the player's team actually had? And I ask this because MVP, for the most part, for the last 40 years, with a couple of notable exceptions, has gone to a player on a team that is top 2 or 3 in their conference, whose team has won 50 or more games or the equivalent in a shortened season. And we've had a couple departures from that in recent years, notably Jokic a year ago. Do any of these all-in-one stats actually bake in the win total, or is it all just relative to, well, the player has great impact because he did all of these things at a high level, and here's the number that shows it?
Directly, I'm not going to say no, but probably less directly. However, a lot of these things are, it's going to be hard to show up. Lillard is sort of a notable outlier in this case. Although, I mean, the record when he played was a fair bit better than Portland's record overall this season. But in general, it's going to be hard to show up especially well on sort of a well-constructed version of these statistics without a fair amount of team success, because if your team is getting outscored with you on the floor, maybe they'd be getting outscored by much more, but it's still like there's a little bit of almost how good could you really be? As an aside, by the way, and Kevin Pelton, Span is on this call, and I go back and forth on this particular point a lot. I think that team wins are an important aspect of this, both from a kind of a historical narrative standpoint. What player mattered this year? I think if we for as great as Lillard was, the Trailblazers were largely irrelevant in the story of this season, and so him getting awards consideration feels wrong in that way. And also, just from the standpoint of in a sport like basketball, where single players have an enormous impact, I think that taking a team from 35 to 45 wins isn't as valuable as taking a team from 50 to 60. I think, and I wrote at The Athletic earlier this year, it's kind of demonstrable that to get that like 50 to 60 wins, you're kind of beating better teams. your kind of marginal wins no longer come against the bad teams; they come against the really good teams. And so I think on some level that assisting a team to do that, I think you're producing that at almost a higher level of difficulty. Well, no, that's an argument rather than proof.
Sure, but I would say a very pertinent argument in this discussion when we're talking about most valuable player, the most important award that anybody can win in the NBA, aside from, I guess, Finals MVP. We talked about the all-in-one stats that in the public realm that you feel are the most reliable, EPM, RAPM. What are the ones that we should just throw out entirely? Are there any that you just think, I don't even know why this one is still sitting on this one site that everybody goes to, or every time you see it cited in somebody's coverage or a tweet, a fan is making, whoever's making the argument, and you see this one stat of this one which is the one that drives you up the wall, or the one that we should just excise from our vocabulary?
So I've got three answers to this. One of them is one that I think is maybe has got a little bit of the difference between what we have at our disposal to look at these things now versus when it's created. I think PER has been surpassed as a useful, as a frontline stat. I think it still does have a decent amount of usage, especially not necessarily comparing one player to another, but looking at the time series of a player's career, you can kind of get a good idea of how their role and performance has changed over time. If you look at, he came into the league, he was about average, and then he had a couple of years of high 20s, and then he trailed off and finished his career at like a 12 or something like that. And I may or may not have just described Carmelo Anthony. So that's one. A stat that I don't love using, and this is more because of the confusion, is Basketball Reference has a pair of stats called offensive and defensive rating, which, to be fair to them, these are stats that were developed by Dean Oliver, now a assistant coach with the Wizards. They gain currency before the kind of the per 100 on four things, which I think we'll probably touch on again. But they're completely different. They're calculated stats that are based on box score and a bunch of other stuff. But it's very confusing because if you go on Basketball Ref, it's like, oh, look, on Basketball Ref, he had a offensive rating of blah, blah, blah. And versus if you go on NBA.com, it's just going to show how many points per possession his team scored while he was on the floor. And I think that version of it has sort of gained the most currency, but having two very different stats, the same name, is confusing. And so I kind of want people to be, aware of that. And I kind of don't love the versions on the Basketball Ref anyway, because I think they were, again, created before we had great play-by-play data or wealth of it. And we probably have data to do better. Oh, and the one that I'll take some shots at and say when it ever gets brought up is a stats called wins produced, which basically is based on a model that completely ignores the value of shot creation, and so very much overvalues rebounding, especially defensive rebounding, which is sort of one of the most assignable stats in the league. Give or take 55% of all rebounds in the NBA these days are uncontested defensive rebounds. And a team can basically decide who gets those rebounds. And that's not really adding anything to what the team is, because everyone got out of your way and, I don't know, let you grab the 10th rebound for a triple-double.
I feel like wins produced was something I used to see on stats sites all the time, and it has disappeared or faded from view, right? So it seems like that's less of a potential pitfall for folks than it maybe once was.
Yeah, I think for the most part, the stats that get discussed in the public realm are generally pretty good. Like EPM is sort of the best performing on certain tests, but it's fractional rather than it being a huge gap. I
see that Larry Coon, our great overlord, has reappeared.
I'm shocked to hear that Tendex is no longer the gold standard, Seth.
If Larry has reappeared, it must mean we're getting pretty close to winding down and going to Q&A. So Larry, I'll let you take that away.
Sounds great. Hey, thanks for a great discussion, Howard and Seth. And we will go to question and answer. But first, we have something coming up here in July. Howard, Seth, did you guys know this?
I heard something about it.
You did, yeah. So July 9th through 15th in Las Vegas, Nevada, Sports Business Classroom Immersive Experience. So we are immersed in the NBA Summer League. And when I say immersed, I mean we are immersed. We are right there in the arena. The whole league is there for an extended period of time. We bring the league to us. We put ourselves out there in Summer League. So the immersion is like nothing else. We have great curriculum. Great working experiences, great term projects. If you're interested in working in basketball or even in sports in general, SBC is not only a great place to learn great stuff, but also to build your network with fellow students who are also breaking in, and also build your network within people working in the league today. There's no other experience like this. And I know Howard and Seth can both attest to this. Registration is now open for Sports Business Classroom. Go to sportsbusinessclassroom.com in order to register or find out more information about the program. And because you people came to this webinar and spent the time, so we know that you're serious learners, you're interested in some pretty deep topics in the MBA, I'm going to give you a discount. How about if we use the code JOKER? If you use the code JOKER, I'm going to give you $300 off of the program. Again, registration now open. Sportsbusinessclassroom.com. We'll be there July 9th through 15th, immersed in the Summer League in Las Vegas, Nevada. Now that we got business out of the way, let's go to some questions. All right. So Diego Torres asks, I see some stats that say Denver's defense is better with Jokic on the court than Philadelphia's defense is with Embiid on the court. So how much does that have to do with who's on the court with them as opposed to who is actually impacting it more?
I would say it has something like that. It's much more to do with who's with them and also who they're playing against, especially in an era where players are missing games. For both teams, like kind of who you're playing against can have a pretty big impact on what kind of defense it looks like you're playing. Your defense is going to look a lot better if your minutes are more heavily weighted to playing against, I don't know, the Hornets than against the Celtics or something like that. Or if you just happen to be a team, and I think this is because of Denver was anecdotally a popular rest site because of altitude. It's possible that Jokic missed some star players who, if I remember correctly, Giannis didn't play in Denver. Embiid didn't play in Denver for that matter. So that has a way of helping those kind of those are objective numbers. Those are what happened. But how you evaluate them needs to have two players is inappropriate because the context sort of swamps whatever signal there might be in the individual player's contribution to those ratings.
Okay, great. And thank you, Diego. Jeremy Sand asks, as our society heads toward a future where we defer to advanced stats and now AI on nearly every front, do you expect to see humans voting for MVP, DPOY, et cetera, 10 years from now? In other words, how quickly can we replace Howard with a bot? That was my commentary, not his.
I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that somebody wanted to do that. So I'll take a crack at this, and Seth, I'm sure you might have thoughts as well. So obviously, as a media person who has been a voter for more often than not for a couple of decades, I believe in these awards as something that is always been bigger than the numbers. It is about numbers and narrative, the dreaded narrative. It is about the season. It is about the story that's being told, or the season that we just saw, and how we will remember it, how we will commemorate it, how we will think about it in the future. It's all of these things. And it's a human exercise. I've written about the MVP, the process of voting for MVP twice in the last year. Once with a kind of tongue-in-cheek title of basically all of your MVP takes are wrong, me admonishing everybody else for trying to superimpose, I think, some wrong paradigms on the whole process. And another one where I wrote a week or so ago for GQ about the idea of voter fatigue, which I push back on. Right. And the reason I keep coming back to these themes is this is a human, the MVP is a human construct, and we have humans voting for it, and it's human judgments. And we're doing the best we can as individuals, as 100 voters. Used to be up to 130. It's now just 100. But it's 100 people with 100 different interpretations, potentially 100 different interpretations of what most valuable player means. And ultimately, it's a judgment. And somewhere in the judgment of 100 people, you get something that approaches a consensus. And I'm comfortable with that. Maybe not all fans are. Maybe not all the players are. Maybe not all the coaches are. But I think that this is still best done as a combination of human judgments across a span of people who cover the league from various angles. And if people don't like it that way and they want to just feed it to the algorithm, cool. I mean, yes, it would be a lot less fun. I think we'd have a lot less to discuss if we just came up with one algorithm that everybody agrees on, and EPM will just tell us every year who the MVP is. I don't see the fun in that, or it's not interesting. And so, no, to answer the listener's question, thank you for the question. I don't see a future. God, I hope I don't see a future in 10 years where the computer's just telling us who the MVP is. I would much rather have us screaming at each other about who the MVP is than to just leave it to the computer.
And to your point, Howard, in order for that to happen, we'd have to precisely define our terms. And we've approached that to no degree, zero, in the last 60 years. And that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, Larry, in that that's something we sort of skip by, is part of the reason why it doesn't make sense to sort of one number the MVP is. We haven't really actually defined what we're maximizing, what we're optimizing for, when we're measuring that. I mean, again, I mentioned earlier, Kevin Pelton and myself have very different opinions about whether a certain aspect matters or not, and that's until that is defined. I think that means that different methods would apply, would bring different and differently accurate results. Quickly, I just want to add I agree with everything Howard said. I want to say that as the deference towards the stats, I really think what's happening is people have realized that the stats can allow you to contextualize the whole league more quickly. No one's watched all 1,230 games of the season, but you can look at the stats of all 1,230 games and get a decent idea of where players are. You can limit, a lot of it in draft modeling, we say we're limiting the size of the haystack that you can find the needle in. We're eliminating a bunch of players, and now we can talk about these 5 or 6 guys. And I think what that's more done is I think, and it may be the stats, it may be kind of the shame factor of all votes being public now. I think we see just a fewer kind of wacky votes where local beat writer, it has the 12th best player in the league on their team, but he gets their first MVP vote because he's our guy. I think we kind of don't really see that as much anymore, which maybe is an evidence of groupthink, or it might just be that it means that we are doing a better job of using the stats to kind of define what the discussion should be about.
So John Alex Voss asks, "What up, Beck? Thanks so much for doing this. Great idea." I agree. Wondering if you could talk about how the impact of analytics varies between different awards, such as MVP versus DPOI versus All-NBA. Thanks.
Ooh. What up? Thank you for giving me the what up. This is actually a really good question, because I would, it's important for people to know, I think, when we're all sitting down to do this exercise. First of all, it's a different exercise today than it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago before we had a lot of these new stats available to us, right? At one point in time, it was just the raw box score and impressions and discussions. And that's the other thing too. Again, back to the human element here. Any of us who are in position to actually vote on these things, we're not just immersed in the game every day by covering it. We're talking to coaches and players and GMs and scouts and everybody who know the game on a much more intimate level and sophisticated level than I do. I'm a reporter. I'm not a basketball person. I'm a reporter who covers basketball, and it's an important distinction. And so I talk to the experts, and I try to get their impressions too. So there's some crowdsourcing that goes into this as well. But in terms of how to apply the data to these individual awards, it's interesting. So for MVP, which as Seth and I alluded to earlier, is largely offensively based, right? We are generally pulling from a pool of players who are in the top 5, 10, 15 in the league in scoring, and probably pretty high up there in efficiency, and probably have some smattering of rebounds and assists and steals and blocks, whatever. We all kind of recognize what that top tier is, right? And then we can debate about how we sort it all out. So there's where the stats come into play there, and including the advanced stats that we've discussed on this webinar. Defensive Player of the Year, we didn't get to this in the chat that Seth and I had, but Defensive Player of the Year, we just don't have those stats. There are some defensive metrics out there, but folks like Seth will tell us pretty quickly that they're not all that accurate necessarily, or not all that telling, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, Seth, but maybe they're not quite good enough. And maybe the teams have proprietary stuff that's better than what we can get. And so for Defensive Player of the Year, and for the all defensive teams, I lean much, much more heavily on my crowdsourcing of the people who are actually playing, coaching, scouting, because I don't know that there's any way to, as Seth noted, 1,230 games. That's the right number, right, Seth? 1,230. None of us have watched all 1,230. Not even Zach Lowe has watched all 1,230, though.
And more games starting next year.
And more games. Thank you, Adam Silver. And then the last piece is this, and I'll shut up. The All NBA thing is a different exercise for me than MVP, and not all voters think this way or would agree with my the prism that I look at this through. MVP to me, because of the valuable part, because of the V in there, the wins and winning with their team matters much more to me for that award. So I'm going to have a much narrower view of who gets on my MVP ballot. And for All NBA, to me, it's more about individual excellence. MVP is to me a distillation or combination of individual excellence and team success. All NBA to me is more about the individual excellence. I'm not as concerned. It's not to say that I throw wins out the window. It's not to say that I'm going to grab somebody off of, like, Trae Young's not making it just because his numbers jumped off the. It's a bad example anyway. But a player with great stats on a bad team probably not going to make it anyway, especially in a competitive year with a lot of candidates for a particular position. But in general, I'm not weighing wins quite as heavily for All NBA as I do for MVP. To me, it's a higher standard, and the team success is baked in.
So by your metrics, is it possible for the MVP not to be All NBA, or at least not all first team?
No. It's the other way around. It's that
because an MVP has to come from a team with a high win count.
Yes.
So if there's 5 extraordinary players from 5 different teams with low win counts.
Yeah, they're not making my MVP ballot. I mean, and granted, again, it's a sliding scale. To get number 1 on my ballot, you have to have the highest combination, in my view, of the individual success and team success. The 5th spot on the ballot, it might be more individual success and a little less team success.
Okay.
So, Luka might creep on there, although not this year.
All right. So team success still figures into your All NBA, especially first team, but just not as heavily as MVP.
No. And in general, and because we also have 3 teams of it, right? We have 15 players that are getting on there. But again, it's similar to All-Star. Nobody cares when they're voting for All-Star whether a player whether their team is winning at midseason. Maybe some people do, but I do think that certain awards are. Seth is squinting at me. Certain awards are more about the individual excellence. And I know that, listen, to Seth's implied point by his squinting, any individual excellence, if it's not feeding team success, then what's the point? I think that's what, Seth is nodding at me. I get that. I do think that All NBA is about who the best players in the league were that year. And sometimes you're a great player on a shitty team. Sometimes you're a great player who maybe had a bit of an off year by your standards, but you were still incredible in what you did. It didn't translate to team success for whatever reason. I don't apply as strict of a standard there. I just think MVP is a different award.
Okay, great. Next question. We have Hovo, our guy Hovo. Hey, Hovo. I feel as though the eye test will always be used as a loophole for people to use anecdotal evidence and bias to discount any numerical metric that comes up in the future, even those built off the eye test itself, like what Pro Football Focus does. Do you agree? And before I'm turning it over to these guys, since this is hitting one of my areas of interest, yes, our heads are filled with wetware that is buggy, and that we, in the normal course of events, exercise all sorts of cognitive biases all the time, including expectation bias, confirmation bias, right? If you pay attention to what fits with what you think and tend to immediately dismiss the things that do not. So yeah, people are going to focus on what they already agree with and what's going to fit into their already developed, to use Howard's favorite word, narrative. And that's just how brains work. And it takes a lot of training to get away from that. All right, you guys take it.
So, well, I want to disagree with the premise of the question, because it sort of implies that statistical analysis and the use of statistical analysis is not subject to said biases. The best example I can think of this, and it's sort of the availability heuristic is sort of the sort of formal name of it. There's the apocryphal. I think an apocryphal. He didn't actually say this Einstein quote that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Which basically means just because we can measure something doesn't mean it matters. The best example I can think of in sports analytics off the top of my head is catcher defense in baseball. They didn't know how to measure the value of a catcher framing pitches to get more strikes. For a long time. So for a long time, they thought that the catcher was one of the least valuable defensive positions in baseball. And then they figured out how to measure it. It's like, oh shit, catchers are actually maybe right up there with shortstops in terms of being the most valuable defensive position on the field. But if you'd just blindly followed the sort of the best knowledge at the time without considering the fact that there's stuff we're not capturing that matters, you lead yourself into the same sort of narrative-driven, biased decision-making and evaluations that the most devoted, real Hooper eye tester would let in. So it's not. I think that the cognitive failings of the human race are not limited. You don't get yourself out of that just because you put a number on something.
Yeah, good point. All right, moving on. Gabe Mendez, another one of our formers. Can these plus minus stats be used to project the careers for younger players? And if so, how?
With great difficulty. Kostya Medvedovsky has created a system called Darko, which you mentioned earlier, which I think does this pretty well. I don't want to get into the weeds of it. It's done a pretty good job. I'll say that I was at times been a skeptic of it, and then it sort of Darko was one of the first things that said, who's going to be really good in about a year? Jamal Murray, and then Jamal Murray was who had been okay but not great to that point. And then before he hurt his knee, was playing at an all-star level. But it's complicated and kind of not error-ridden, but wide confidence intervals, but you can get some more narrow estimates than you might otherwise do. And that's the kind of thing that's probably always going to improve as we get better at things. I will say that unlike, for example, baseball, where kind of player projection is something that's done very well, player role plays a huge part in both how good a player becomes and also how much they produce. And that's sort of a hard thing that there is to predict. Again, to use a good recent example, Donovan Mitchell's career is very different if Gordon Hayward decides to stay in Utah and Mitchell doesn't get the ball in his hands from day one. Is he the same player he is now? I don't think so.
Yeah. Also, who drafts you and how good of a development opportunity you have at wherever you happen to end up.
Let me add something to that too, which is that in the course of my years covering the league, there's something that you realize over time, which is it seems like the most obvious thing, but I feel like it's something that comes to you over time where you start to go, talent doesn't actually equal success in this league all the time. There are a lot of guys who jump really high who don't know how to play basketball. There are a lot of guys who maybe shoot really well and can't do anything else. And there are guys who defend really well and do it. And the point of that is not so much that eye test can fail or that projections can fail or that scouting fails, even though as we see with the draft every year, all the data in the world, all the research in the world, all the new methodology in the world, teams still screw up the draft royally every year. And you still get, obviously some nice, famous recent examples of Giannis being the 15th overall player in the draft and Rudy Gobert being 27th and Nikola Jokic being a second round
undrafted.
Austin Reeves being undrafted. So we have plenty of these examples. And what it brings it back to for me is this. Again, it's back to this human element. The thing that we can't project out and that the stats cannot see or ascertain is that you don't know who's going to work hard. You don't know who cares. You don't know who actually has a passion for the game versus just who's really athletic and got here just because they had some natural ability. And it's what you do with it once you actually get to the league. And so then the team environment, your teammates, the development program that they have or don't have, all these other things start to factor into it. But so much, I think, of NBA success in my observation has been about just the way a person is wired. And it really often just comes down to, all right, the guy who had, just slightly above average talent, but worked his ass off and really cared versus the guy who had all of the natural athletic gifts in the world, but just didn't have a passion for the game or was just kind of a screw up. I don't know that we'll ever get to a point where we can project those things or accurately predict those things.
I think this... Can I one more? I think this actually the next question on our list that is a perfect segue into it. If John Alex Moss asks, what one current gap in knowledge do you see? And to sort of piggyback off what Howard is talking about, the one thing that a lot of our methodologies aren't good at in measuring is decision making. Being good at a sport it's not just put ball in basket. It's all the little things of taking one step to this direction to dissuade a guy from driving. It's when to cut versus when to spot up. It's when to take an extra dribble, when to get off the ball, or all these, like playing basketball is making hundreds, if not thousands of these tiny little decisions. And the best players are the ones who make those decisions correctly. And that involves being able to see the game, perceive what's happening, predict what's going to happen in the future, and then act accordingly. And, people call that different things. It's been called basketball IQ at times. I don't love that phrase. So I'm basically starting to call it feel. We don't have a great way to measure feel. And I think that in terms of a separator between who's going to you can become a competent player at the NBA with pure physical talent and low feel. I don't think you can become a great player without feel. And I don't think we have a great way of measuring currently, or the potential of a player to develop that. And I think that's just alongside the kind of the willingness to work. I think that's a key kind of predictor of success that we just don't know enough about.
That's a great point. All right. Well, we are running really short on time, so we do have a few other questions that I wish we could have gotten to, but we are a little bit past the end of our hour. So I think we'll wrap it up here. If you do want to ask, if you really have burning questions you want to get answered, you can email us at info@sportsbusinessclassroom.com. One of us will take it and get back to you individually because that's the kind of guys we are here. But we are going to wrap up the webinar here. So Howard, Seth, thank you both so much for the very informative discussion. We look forward to more webinars and especially to your presence and your instruction at Sports Business Classroom. Once again, happening July 9th through 15th in Las Vegas, Nevada, immersed in the NBA Summer League. Go to sportsbusinessclassroom.com to register. Use the code JOKER for $300 off. So on behalf of Howard and Seth, thank you all for attending, and we will see you later.